Were there people trapped inside the Titanic as it sank? It's a macabre question. The simple answer is yes, probably lots of them were, but for reasons that may surprise you. Who were they? Why were they there, and what ultimately happened to them? Today, let's explore this sad topic and find out who was trapped inside the Titanic as it sank. It was long and often repeated that the first people to die that night were the mailroom clerks, trapped down in the bow of the ship as they tried to save the ship's mail. But this just isn't true. They did try dragging the mail bags one deck higher. They gave up when they realised the situation was hopeless and they abandoned their post. All of them died, but they were not trapped inside the ship. 2 of their bodies were even recovered on the surface. But if the mailroom clerks weren't the first to lose their lives that night, then who was? Well, first, let's look at the verified but tragic case of 2 men who were trapped in the ship as it sank and were probably the first to die that night in the sinking. 32-year-old Jonathan Shepherd was junior assistant second engineer from Cumberland in the United Kingdom. He'd joined the White Star Line and served on the Adriatic, and then Titanic's sister ship Olympic. In fact, he was even on board when Olympic was rammed by the cruiser HMS Hawke and played a role in lowering the watertight doors that saved the ship. Shepherd was on duty the night Titanic hit the iceberg and was in a party of men trying to rig pumps and lines to stem the flow of water into boiler room number 5. He was helping out in that boiler room, which was slowly flooding, when he stepped into one of the many uncovered manholes on the ship's tank top. These were small holes that gave access to the tanks in the bottom of the ship. Either it was too dark or escaping steam was obscuring his vision, but he didn't see the hole in time and he broke his leg. His mates dragged him out and carried him over into a small pump room to keep him out of the way of the commotion. Some short time later, though, the weight of water behind the boiler room's bulkhead caused it to collapse, and in roared a wall of water. The men inside ran up the emergency ladders to escape, but engineer Herbert Harvey remembered that Shepherd was still lying inside the pump room. He turned around to try to save his mate, but it was too late. He was swept away by a wall of green foam, and poor Shepherd was drowned, trapped inside the pump room. When the topic of people being trapped inside the Titanic comes up, most people think of the third-class passengers, and movies do a lot to shape the way that we see historic events. This is especially true of the Titanic disaster. So many myths have survived the 110 years since the ship sank that it can be difficult to navigate the topic and find out what is actually fact. One popular story from the night of the sinking revolves around the plight of the third-class passengers, and in every movie recreation of the sinking, you'll see a scene where crowds of desperate immigrants are kept behind gates by crew members until the lifeboats can be loaded with the upper classes. Ostensibly then, these people were left down below to drown as the ship sank. But did this actually happen? Well, evidence tells us no, not in the way you'd expect. See, Titanic existed in a heavily class-segregated society, and this is in fact reflected in the way that Titanic's accommodation plan was laid out. Split between 3 classes, ticket holders could pay for tickets according to their means. This is an obvious and well-known fact, but what you might not know is that much of the ship's accommodation was designed to be interchanged between classes. See, first-class cabins lower down in the ship could, in the event of overbooking, be given to second-class ticket holders instead, and that section of staterooms could be cordoned off for second class. The same is true of many second-class cabins lower down in the ship. These could be interchangeably third class if necessary, and vice versa. To control the passengers' movements and restrict them to the areas their tickets actually entitled them to, sparingly few gates were actually used. If you believe the movies, you'd think that every staircase and door leading out of third class was gated and locked, but it's just not true. At the inquiries after the disaster, third-class steward John Hart was questioned on if there were locked gates designed to keep passengers down. Hart indicated that there were small, portable gates separating third and second class areas as per Board of Trade regulations of the time. No, he said. Well, the barrier, that lifts over, and the gate, that fixes in. You can just take it out with your hand. It is never locked, he continued. I had to pass through them and I saw them open. In fact, third-class passengers had a couple of very easy means of getting up and out of the ship, which 5 days into the voyage they'd have been very familiar with. Every class did. First class had the forward and aft grand staircases which ran up to the boat deck. Second class had 2 staircases towards the stern of the ship, one at the second class entrance and one further aft. And third class had 2 main staircases leading outside, at the forward well deck and at the aft well deck. None of these staircases could be or was ever blocked, and all of them were very easily accessible from the passengers' staterooms and would have needed to be used daily by passengers in order to just get around the ship in the first place. Passenger testimonies also dispel the idea of third-class passengers being purposely locked down in the bottom of the ship. At inquiries after the sinking, third-class passenger Daniel Buckley was asked if he thought his fellow passengers had been kept locked below decks. "I do not think so," he said. "Did these passengers in the steerage have any opportunity at all of getting out?" he was asked. "Yes, they had. I think they had as much chance as first and second class passengers," he said. But Buckley did come across a gate which a steward had locked. It was at the top of the stairs leading up from the third class promenade space on the forward well deck. Not exactly intimidating, and intended more as a discouraging measure than a totally preventative one. It was here that third class passengers complained about being kept waiting and prevented from accessing the boats, not deep within the ship. The gate was around or slightly below waist height, and after a while, Buckley's fellow passengers simply broke the small lock on its latch and made their way up to the boat deck and the lifeboats. For those in third class, though, getting to the lifeboats was another matter entirely. These were kept only in the second and first class promenades on the boat deck area, an area which third class passengers were totally unfamiliar with. So if third class passengers on the Titanic had so many relatively easy ways of getting out of the ship, how come so many didn't seem to make it out? Well, accounts tell us that instead of a malicious attempt at keeping third class trapped below, many of those passengers were the victims more of confusion. At first, many third class passengers packed their meagre belongings into cases and bags and just waited outside their cabins for instruction. As the ship continued to sink and water began to reach into the third class spaces, crowds of them began to trundle slowly afterwards towards the stern of the ship up Scotland Road, which was the long corridor linking the forward and aft parts of the ship for third class and crew. Not because they were instructed to do so, but because they were just being slowly chased by rising water. Why didn't the crew help, and why wasn't instruction on evacuating the ship forthcoming? The simple truth is that the ship's crew were so unprepared and simply preoccupied and rushed in trying to fill and lower the lifeboats that the third class passengers below were overlooked. The evacuation plan for the ship was poorly thought out, and in the rush, it seems that there was no system in place to ensure that clear instructions were given to third class from above. Some climbed the steps up to the third class spaces at the stern of the ship and gathered there, still awaiting instruction from crew on what to do. Meanwhile, the lifeboats were being filled and lowered with whatever passengers were standing ready nearby. With no news or instruction coming, many third class passengers simply milled around or gave up. One passenger, August Wernstrom, recalled, "One of our friends, a man by the name of John Lundahl, had been home to the old country on a visit and was going back to the United States. He said to us, 'Goodbye friends, I'm too old to fight the Atlantic.' And he went to the smoking room, and there on a chair was awaiting his last call. So did an English lady. She sat down by the piano, and with her child on her knees, she played the piano until the Atlantic grave called them both." For those trying to get out of third class, another insidious problem faced them. Titanic's complex, labyrinth-like interior featured maze-like corridors and confusing twists and turns. If any third-class passengers became disoriented in trying to escape, there was no helpful notation or signs to point out where to go, and no maps of the ship's layout. A number of stewards who survived recalled stumbling upon groups of confused and lost steerage passengers and leading them up and out of the ship, but for many, rescue may never have come. As the situation got worse and the ship's angle in the water began to increase, it seems clear that many third-class passengers must have simply given up all hope of rescue. Many made it to the upper decks, but it seems that many more stayed inside. After the ship had sunk, 23% of the people who died in the sinking had their bodies recovered. Far more third-class passengers died on the Titanic, and the rate of body recovery was a measly 14%. This low number may tell us that many third-class passengers could have stayed inside Titanic until the very end, confused and lost in the ship's corridors, or having given up hope and staying huddled together with loved ones in their cabins or in the ship's general and smoking room at the stern. Whatever the reason for staying inside the Titanic, the end must have been terrifying. The ship's stern rose high out of the water at an angle of 20 or 30 degrees, and any passengers who'd stayed inside must have been bunched up against bulkheads and walls, hanging on to whatever they could to find balance. The lights grew dimmer and slowly redder as the ship's electrical generators began to strain until finally around 2:18 AM, they snapped out for good, as the ship broke apart. Anybody in the brake zone would have been crushed or drowned as Titanic's huge hull tore itself apart. The ship's bow plunged down and pulled the stern back up nearly vertical, and anybody inside would have been thrown in a heap. Titanic's bow had flooded slowly and gently over the course of 2 hours, but now the stern was being bodily pulled down into the ocean at a rate of knots. On the outside from a distance, it maybe looked like the stern was gliding gently into the ocean, but inside, this would have been a very violent affair. The bulkheads and walls separating Titanic's cabins and passenger spaces were mostly just made of thin timber. Steel walls were only mostly used around bathrooms and toilets. As the stern was pulled under, having not had the time to flood properly, air would have been pushed violently out as water began to surge inside, breaking down the cabin bulkheads and walls with enormous force. Anybody caught in the way would have been likely killed not by drowning, but by perhaps blunt force trauma, as the interior rooms and spaces were demolished by tons and tons of unstoppable, surging water. Like a tsunami, it would have risen inside the ship, knocking down bulkheads like they were made out of paper, until finally Titanic's stern had sunk below the surface. That wasn't the end though. The stern had sunk too quickly and hadn't yet totally filled with water. Whatever spaces remained full of air now had immense water pressure begin to act on them from the outside, and as the stern sank lower and lower, this only began to increase. Just after the stern had left the surface, survivors remembered huge explosive booms coming from underneath them. This was the stern section imploding as massive air pockets inside the ship were overwhelmed by the pressure of tons upon tons of water, and at about 500 feet of depth, they violently burst and ripped huge sections of Titanic's stern apart with their force. Anybody trapped alive inside any of these air pockets would have been killed instantly. But what about Titanic's engineers? Everybody knows they valiantly stayed at their post to the end, keeping some of the boilers lit and generating steam so that the lights could still burn. These men were led by Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and numbered 25 engineers, 6 electricians, a plumber, and a clerk. The commonly held belief is that they stayed down in the belly of the ship until it sank around them and took them with it. But this actually isn't the case. They did stay as long as they could, trying to pump water and keeping the lights burning, but towards the end, it became apparent to Bell that any more attempts at saving the ship would be futile. Titanic engine room crew member Frederick Scott was on deck at the end, having just made his way up from below. He told the British Wreck Inquiry that he saw all the engineers on deck right at the very end, some of whom had followed him up the escape ladder. It seems likely that Bell had released his men, but they arrived on deck too late. All the lifeboats had already been launched. Bell and all of his staff were lost in the sinking, but they were not trapped and drowned, as is commonly repeated. Today, Titanic's wreck lies in 2 pieces on the bottom of the ocean. I mentioned earlier that the bow section flooded slowly and gently, and this is evidenced by its good condition. Inside, there are even still water glasses sitting intact on upright washstands where their owners last left them. But the stern is a different story. There is nothing inside left intact. The damage from the violent flooding and the implosion was so great that whole chunks of the side plating were torn off as if it was papier-mâché, and the interiors were completely stripped bare. There is a deep sense of foreboding about the stern, and it's seldom visited by the expedition dives. It still stands 4 kilometers deep on the sea floor as a tomb for dozens of unfortunate passengers who were caught behind in the sinking. Frank Prentice was a storekeeper who narrowly survived the sinking, and as an old man, the night still haunted him. He reflected on the topic and summarized it best in a TV interview.
And there must have been a lot of pockets of air, and they must have suffered more than I did, I imagine. Gradually dying. Because there were bulkheads all over their place. And people, some of them, didn't leave their cabins even. And they must have died in their cabins. And they must have had a lingering death. It was almost like murder, wasn't it?